So welcome everybody. I'm here with really one of my oldest friends, Ken Hersh. This is a real honor to talk to Ken, and I've known Ken for many, many years, from days before we shaved, and we went to the same school together, and I have watched Ken incorporate some incredible life lessons along the way and be a very successful person in so many different ways. And I hope this interview, Ken, teases out a lot of those great nuggets that have put you in the position where you are today, which is, the way I see you is, people can judge you by your financial success, but I think really the Mount Rushmore of Ken Hersh is your personal successes. So delighted to do this. Thank you for making the time.
Happy to do it, Craig.
So I want to start quickly with your childhood because, seeing you today, somebody might say, well, you went to St. Mark's, you probably grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and a little bit of the experience of going to St. Mark's.
You didn't tell me we're going back to childhood. My upbringing was the greatest gift of my life, frankly, was that my parents enrolled me at St. Mark's, and I spent 12 years there, grew up in Dallas. St. Mark's was a lot of stability for me. Obviously, a school that you go to for 12 years, you're going to have that kind of continuity. My mother was an economics professor. She taught school up at Texas Women's University in Denton, and my father was a podiatrist. When my parents divorced, my mother remarried. My stepfather was also an economics professor from the North Texas State University, what's now UNT. They were working hard and traveling to Denton and back every day. So, my day was the school. And because the school was so all enveloping, a school like that you feel comfortable at, that you're doing reasonably well at, there's athletics, there's extracurricular activities and all the rest. And the value for me growing up was all around education. With two college professors in the house, that was what you picked up by osmosis. So, there was never a doubt to dive into school. And if you're going to do it, you might as well dive in and try to get the most out of it. And if there's extracurriculars, you might as well try to really dive into them. And, in high school, where if you're the person who says, I'll stay an extra hour to write this article, well, pretty soon you're going to be the editor of the paper because everyone else wants to go home, but you'll stay the extra hour. And so I just got involved in activities. The two big activities I did growing up at St. Mark's were being the editor of the newspaper and the captain of the debate team. And Craig, that's obviously where you and I connected the most. But those were both activities that, kind of brought you out of your shell. The newspaper, you got to wander around campus, you're talking to everybody, and it was a big undertaking. And then debate is obviously something that you travel around and you spend your summers doing, and it can consume as much time as you let it. And so to me, those activities were very rewarding because they were so all encompassing and the feedback loops were really good. And, if you win a debate tournament, within 15 or 20 minutes if you won it or not. And those are the things that kind of feed you after a while. And so your friendships, when you put out a newspaper, I remember just getting a charge when the newspaper came out, everybody grabbed one and they're all around the halls reading it, and sitting on their lockers and sitting on the floors, and just the whole school is reading it the day it comes out. And you kind of walk around and go, hey, look, they're reading, and then people, give me grief for what we might have written or not written but anyway, that to me, having that kind of environment was really the greatest gift anybody could have given me. And I still have great feelings for the school. And my son went there for 12 years and I served on the board for 18 years. And I've given it my time, my money, and my resources to make it better and pay it forward.
Yes, you have. I'm going to pull some of those threads forward because I suspect some of those lessons of kind of, as you said, getting out of your comfort zone and talking to people and getting the feedback loop of others' perspectives is a theme we're going to hear about. And I'm going to do something completely unfair and jump past Princeton and past Stanford Business School and take you right up to the point where you decided to apply for a job, as I remember you telling me the story, with a guy named Richard Rainwater. Tell us a little bit about that story when you're at Stanford and you get the idea to do that.
I had been at Morgan Stanley for 2 years. I was in the analyst program, which was kind of yuppie boot camp, number crunching and working 100-hour weeks. And, the transaction natures in 85 to 87 was really a great place to be. There were a lot of transactions. It was really the emergence of Drexel and the junk bond era and LBOs. And so companies being taken over. And so there was just a lot of activity. And then they put me in the energy group because I was from Texas. even though I didn't know the difference between natural gas and gasoline, but they said, oh, go there. And so I did. And that happened to be where there was a lot of action, which was all great to learn. But I just didn't feel right in that transaction environment where you're basically kind of a fee for service model. No offense to the lawyers on this call, but just didn't fit me as well. So when I went to Stanford, the recruiters came to campus for summer jobs, and I tried to think outside the box a little bit. And there was a thing that people were chirping about, and it was called principal investing. And there was no such thing as the private equity industry. The words private and equity weren't even together. And so I said, principal investing. Yeah, there are some places where people are investing their own money. And I go, really, what do you mean investing and their money? Because I was thinking companies. I wasn't thinking about investing. And lo and behold, I made a few phone calls, and the feedback that came back, somebody said, the Bass family, the Bass brothers down in Texas, you're from Texas, you must know the Bass brothers. Of course, I grew up in Dallas, and my parents were economics professors in Denton. I didn't know the Bass family in Fort Worth, Texas. And so, I looked it up, and I saw the Bass brothers, and I saw some of the stuff that they had done in the early 80s. And so I called a buddy at Morgan Stanley, and I said, do you know anybody at the Bass brothers? And the guy says, oh, no, the person you need to talk to is Richard Rainwater. He really did a whole bunch of stuff for the Basses, and he's gone out on his own. Maybe he'll need people, because he went out on his own a couple of years ago. So, of course, I have this image of this guy named Richard Rainwater sitting in his office waiting for people to call him and send him their resumes because he needs help. That's how naive I was. But anyway, so I called information and got the number for Richard Rainwater's office. And then I called the number and I said, I want to send Mr. Rainwater a letter. Can you give me the address? And so the receptionist gave me the address. And so I wrote Richard Rainwater a cold call letter and said, I'm Ken Hersh, and I'm a first year at Stanford, and I'm looking for a summer job, and here's my resume, and I'd love to talk to you about any opportunity that might be helpful. I mean, it was completely nonspecific. And the true story is that about 2 or 3 or 4 days later, I was kind of waiting patiently thinking, okay, I put it in the mail, takes 3 days to get there, then I don't want to be a pest or be over anxious, so I'll wait a couple days. So I was kind of planning when I would call, and one morning my phone rang, and I happened to be at my house, which is highly unusual for students, but I was at my house, and the woman on the other line said, Ken Hersh? I said, yes. This is hold the line for Mr. Rainwater. And I thought it was one of my friends gigging me, who I'd told I was interviewing, or, what letters I was in. We were all comparing notes. And I thought it was one of my friends who was really messing with me. So I'm on the phone, and gentleman voices on the phone and says, you want the quote? And I said, now I'm really confused. Do I want the quote? I'm thinking maybe it's 10 o'clock in the morning. So as the stock market crashed again, remember, this was like January of 88 and October of 87. We all woke up out in California. And by the time we woke up, the market had already crashed, and all these young investment bankers who had pocketed their bonus money, which was second semester tuition, put it in the markets. All of a sudden, we're lining up at the financial aid office. It was a big distress. So I'm thinking quote, yeah, give me the quote. And the guy says, well, I called my buddy over at Morgan Stanley, and he said, you were the best analyst they ever had, and I got to talk to you. When can you get here? And I said, I'll call you back. I had been kind of just randomly signing up for interviews at the time, trying to get a summer job. And I had an upcoming interview with McKinsey. So, McKinsey's frustrated always because the Stanford MBAs all want to work in their San Francisco office. And they only had, a few openings. And so when I'm interviewing with McKinsey, I kind of let it drop, well, I might be interested in working in your Dallas office. And the guy goes, really? And I said, yeah, but I'd like to see it first. He goes, and he on the spot, he was like, well, we can make that happen. I said, great. Well, why don't we set that up? So I walked out of that meeting saying, I don't know if I'm going to work at McKinsey, but at least I got my airplane now to back home. So long story short, that's what I did. And I went over to see Richard. I was interviewing with McKinsey, and I gave it a legitimate interview. And then I went over to see Richard in the afternoon and had this really surreal meeting with the guy. And one thing led to another after graduation, and we started NGP with a couple other people.
It's such a multi-layered story, and he's such an interesting guy. For those who don't know, Richard Rainwater, some basically say he created private equity, right? I mean, that's really your point when you say there wasn't such a thing as private equity, because he was diversifying the wealthy oil investors' money, the Bass family in that case. It's interesting. I've heard you talk about him many times, and I know you gave a eulogy at his funeral. If you were going to give people listening to this a crystallization of what made Richard Rainwater special, what would it be?
Richard had an electric personality. He had a incredibly encyclopedic and analytic intuition. because he never cranked a number. At least I didn't see him. When I officed with him for 11 years, I never saw him with a calculator. But he'd say, well, if we did that, let's say that's worth whatever. And then if we took that and over there, that's worth whatever. I mean, he could actually envision, and through intuition, and obviously he was calculating in his head, but he had that raw ability as an investor to understand the risk reward of what he was doing. But most importantly, until Crescent kind of took off and he went on the road shows and had to become part of a public company with John Goff, and they built that like crazy. But from 1989 to 1994, that 5-year period, I don't think I remember him getting on an airplane. And the number of people who would come to Fort Worth, Texas to see this guy was staggering. And he didn't really do very many deals. He had 2 or 3 meetings, like a doctor's office. He would have the conference rooms going 2 or 3 people deep. And they'd be sitting in the waiting room. Yeah, I had a 10 o'clock appointment with Rainwater. Yeah, so did I. And he would put people in conference rooms and run around, and he'd get everybody in the office to help him run around. I mean, it was fascinating. And he might have done, a couple deals a year, so which means 98% of the time was nothing. These people loved coming here. They loved spilling their ideas to him. They loved the interchange. And that was my biggest takeaway, really, watching him treat these people right, thanking them for coming to Fort Worth, even though he had no intention of doing business with them. And he offered them something. He said, maybe, look, it doesn't fit me exactly, but let me refer you to somebody, or let me give you some advice. And then years later, years would go by and people would call me and say, oh, Richard's a great friend. He said if I ever had anything to give him a call. I'm like, Richard, do you remember this person? He's like, I have no idea. They had this moment with him and they got something out of it. There were people who said, hey, I'm sending you money. And he'd go, why? And he said, well, because you gave me this idea about how to do this deal for no money by taking this over here and doing this over here and just having that left. And so I did that, and this turned into something. And so I always said, I'm going to keep a point or two of this company reserved for Richard because it was his idea. And they'd like, here's a check 10 years later. I mean, just stuff like that just would never happen today, happened. And so to me, one of the things that I always tried to do at NGP was no matter what the deal was, whether we were going to do it or not, whether it was flaky or real, it just didn't matter. If people took the time out to come see me or see our team, I wanted to make sure that we didn't waste their time, we were respectful, and if we could add value back, then and treat the people in the room all well, then good things would happen. And I would tell that to my team all the time. I said, that junior person down at the end of the conference room table, that used to be me, okay? 10 years from now, that person's going to be at the front of the table. Don't discount that person just because they're whoever they are, they come in a meeting. Treat everybody around the table with respect and with value and get something out of it, have them get something from you back. And, that kind of high energy meeting and that interaction and that respect, I mean, it's all balled up. That was the magic of Richard. And that's really one of my biggest takeaways from that time in the office with him, which was a real gift.
Yeah, well, it is a real gift. I'm smack dab in the middle of Ron Chernow's book, Titan, about John D. Rockefeller, which I have to believe you've read as well. And, just thinking about the qualities of these people who took advantage of opportunities. I mean, we're sitting in the middle of a pandemic right now. We're sheltered in place. You're in your home in Dallas. I'm in Park City. I go for a hike and listen to the book on tape. That's how I get out, relax during the day. You think of these people who had the clarity of thought during uncertain times to take advantage of those opportunities. I've heard you talk so many times, Ken, about how he shaped you as a man, not just as a businessman, but as a man. Can you talk a little bit about that? What were some of his personal qualities that made you who you are today?
He's a really nice guy. He's a lot of fun to be around. He looked at every chaos as a opportunity. He'd be the guy as an investor, his instinct would be to run into the burning building. And so he would love a time like this. Now, at the same time, he'd probably be tearing his hair out, going, oh, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. But that was a separate part. The people who know Richard would know that, that he had this moment about him. But from an investment standpoint, he had this clarity. And he said, look, you just got to calm down, just piece together information, but there's opportunity in here somewhere. Our job is to go find it. It was like a treasure hunt, Now, he was a little bit of a hypochondriac, so the health thing, is a little bit different than the financial crisis. I think from an investment standpoint, he would still be thinking about all of the machinations that would come next and try to see around the corner and do it with a spirit. I mean, the guy had a verve. I mean, he had a vibe, and that's what drew people to him. I mean, think about this, where people would schlep to Fort Worth, Texas, on their nickel just to come see him. And I did. Of course, I got someone else's nickel to do it, but I don't know what it is. But there are very few people like him. And it was at a moment in time also that before technology and before we were doing spreadsheets and analysis, but the judgment calls were so far above the spreadsheets. And that's where he was really the master at it. And I can't think of a person. I mean, there are a handful of people in this country who have had that kind of impact on the investment business. You know, like a Michael Milken and Richard is definitely, you use the term Mount Rushmore in my mind. I mean, when you look at the firms that emanated from Richard, and whether it be TPG, I mean, there's sort of the offspring, and then there's the offspring of the offspring, you know, but the whole TPG derivation and Lone Star and NGP and OXIF, and I mean, there's all sorts of firms that count Richard, and then Crescent, and then people who worked at those places. I mean, he's the godfather of trillions of dollars of assets under management. You know, he doesn't get the credit, and he wanted to be that guy who was, you go do it and you can do it, you know, and he would have people think like, well, shit, if not me, who? Right. And you'd sit there and go, yeah, well, why not me? You know, and you go back to your desk and make a call that, you know, at the time I was in my late 20s. Well, heck, I'll call that guy. He's, you know, some fancy CEO of some big company. Well, so what? Let's call him up, you know, and that was Richard.
That's awesome. So you were the guy at the end of the table, and you rose through the ranks. You became the head of NGP. I think people will be probably currently are talking about how you're the parent of a lot of amazing things and entities and a lot of assets under management. What's the advice you give to the young lawyer, the young professional, the young businessman, analyst sitting at the end of that table that you picked up along the way as you rose through the ranks?
It's about relationships, and it's about follow through and connections, not connections as like a network. I mean, it's every meeting is a chance to make a personal connection with somebody. Try to take what you do very seriously, but take yourself a lot less seriously, and understand that the people across the table are just people, and that a good idea doesn't know age and doesn't know seniority. And, you know, there's respectful ways to speak up or to have your thoughts be known. And I'd say one of the drawbacks of the increasing pace, the increasing technology, is to think about in your life how many times you might have an email relationship with somebody or a phone relationship with somebody, and you wouldn't know them if they were sitting next to you in a restaurant because you just had an email relationship. And unless you were introduced to the person, you might not have ever met them. And you don't take the time to go try to meet them. I think that the value of any kind of face-to-face meeting, it's just a gift. I mean, those opportunities are a gift. And so do them. I remember going to these industry conferences and, you know, listening to the same topics over and over, but I would go at the beginning of the conference and stay to the bitter end. And I always said, you know, if I'm going to go and invest the time to go, then I might as well be all in. Okay. Don't sit there and go and check your email and check your, you know, and I would, you know, have to multitask a little bit and run around and check the phones and whatnot. But as I got later and got busier, that I could feel that slipping away, and I missed that. You know, when I went to these industry conferences, go a day early and play in the golf outing. Don't just go to your room at night. Go down to the hotel restaurant, and guess what? There's 5 other people from the conference there too. And if the first meeting is at 8, but there's a continental breakfast at 7, I would go to that. Those kinds of things, and you'd see people at multiple places at multiple times. All of a sudden, they become your friends. You know, I had the luxury being in one industry. Okay, so I was in the oil and gas industry, and so I would go to oil and gas conferences. I'd go to finance conferences around energy. You start seeing the same people, and then we hosted our own things. Over time, in a very short amount of time, these people became my personal friends. They were on my Christmas card list. I was on theirs. You know, we were birthing babies. We were having kids. I was learning from them. I would say, hey, your kids are older. How did you do it? You know, I mean, just can I ask you a personal question? I mean, those kinds of things, that relationship building, I mean, that's the one thing I miss by being retired. My advice to people is take the time. And when you connect with somebody, just see how far it goes.
Your definition of retirement is probably different than a lot of other people's. And what I'm hearing loud and clear is, again, it's the feedback loop, is getting yourself out there into uncomfortable situations to forge relationships and hear different people's perspectives. And then that's where the instinct takes over, right? You've got all this stuff baked into your head and you're not quite sure where it's coming from, but you've got an instinct for a deal or a person. that is instructed by so much data.
And that is so important in that you never know when you're going to access that information later. Always try to get a nugget out of it. Always try to learn something.
As a great person who has taken in from great people, another person who later in your career you got very close to is the former president of the United States, George W. Bush. And in your position at the Bush Institute, and even just through being in the energy industry and everything else, you got to know him along the way. But is there something you can share with people? Forget George W. Bush as president of the United States, but George W. Bush as a human, as a person. What could you tell people that they might not be able to glean from newspaper articles or books?
I'd say that President Bush and Richard Rainwater had a lot of similarities. Frankly, that's how I met President Bush back in the 80s, was through Richard, when then I could call him by his first name, but President Bush was the co-managing partner of the Rangers. And so we had that relationship as friends before he went off to run for governor. And so I knew him in that context. As president, he's the same person. His presidency got hijacked in many ways by 9/11. It was, think about it, that was 8 months after he took office, and his whole transition was delayed because of the Florida recount. And so they were just, in the process of getting although they had a lot of their cabinet and administration people filled, they were still getting started. And then all of a sudden 9/11 hit. And so, it was Herculean what he was able to do in rallying his team and his people. And the loyalty that he instilled in the people around him was just stunning. And the kind of person he is, he's a casual person, but he's a serious person. And he's got a fantastic sense of humor, and he cares deeply about the people who work around him. That EQ, he's got about the highest EQ of anybody I've ever met, about like Richard Rainwater. And so there's a lot of similarities there. But just a quality individual that you feel loyalty to and respect for. Those are great qualities to be around and to hope a little bit rubs off on you.
Yeah, you've been so kind to me in so many ways. And as you know, I have all these visitors who come to Dallas because we're a global law firm, and they'll come and I'll take them by the Presidential Library. And there's one thing you've shown me, I think it's twice now. You come down, you run the whole show and you take your time to come down. And you always go to one exhibit from 9/11. I don't know if you're going to remember what I'm talking about, but you go to one exhibit that really reflects what President Bush, his center. Can you talk a little bit about that if I've connected with you on what that is?
Sure. The George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum side of our building, where the museum is in the 9/11 section, we have a very nice, respectful, but informative montage of the week of 9/11, what happened for that next 10 days. And underneath that is a digital touchscreen of his agenda from 9/11. Every day for the president is scripted down to the minutes. So he knows what's scheduled. They might say private time or whatever, but it's very well scripted. And so he has a record of every day. So his record for that day it's just an amazing day. For the people who won't be able to make it, think about this. Put yourself in this person's shoes. Because to me, this is what's so impressive. Stunningly impressive. President Bush woke up in Sarasota, Florida, went for a jog that morning. The last thing he thought of when he woke up was that in about an hour, we're going to get attacked by terrorists. And I'm going to end up flying around the country in Air Force One and then ending up in Nebraska and then coming back to D.C. to a Pentagon. You think about being the commander in chief in that role. Put yourself in that shoe. He's supposed to go in and talk to some lower schoolers about an education, it's an education initiative, and he's going to read to lower schoolers, and it's a made-for-media kind of event. And it starts at 9:00. Well, at 8:46, the first plane hit the first tower. They were briefed walking into that room. And so he was briefed that something had happened, but they were still in the fog at that moment, not knowing what it was. And so at 9 a.m., and President Bush, everybody who knows him, he is very punctual. So at 9 a.m., he's starting with the kids. At 9:02, the second plane hit the second World Trade Center tower. At 9:05, Andy Card, his chief of staff, walks in the back of the room. President Bush knows something is up. And so at 9:05, your chief of staff, Andy Card, whispers in your ear. And what Andy Card said was, a second plane has hit the second tower. America's under attack. He's whispering in his ear. And there's a fantastic photograph of Andy Card in his ear, and President Bush's, the expression on his face was just, not on my watch. Okay, it was a serious look, but it wasn't a scared look, but it was a serious look. It was a famous photograph. But put yourself in the shoes of President Bush, where you're the commander in chief and somebody just said America's under attack. 9:05. At 9:14, he gets up from that chair to go into the other room. Now, 9 minutes, if you and I sat here for 9 minutes, it would seem like an eternity. Imagine if somebody just told you America's under attack for 9 minutes, right? And you're the commander in chief. But he had that instinct. And this is what's so amazing about President Bush as a leader. Intuitively, he knew the world's going to be watching me. And the American president does not run and does not get rattled. And that instinct took over. He also knew that people outside are going to be mobbing him with questions. So he needed to let his staff do the work, gather what they could. And maybe because his father had been president, maybe because he was not that unfamiliar, I guess, with the tools of the presidency and just what the office of the presidency meant and means. And he said a million times that the office of the presidency of the United States is more important than the occupant of the seat. And so he understood that. And then his day took off. While he's on Air Force One, this is what was amazing to me. So he fluctuated between immediately calling Secretary Rice, and he called Governor Pataki, and he called Giuliani, and he called Vice President Cheney, and he's calling, all of the people around the establishment to figure out what is going on. He stops to make sure the Secret Service goes and gets his daughters. One was at Yale, one was at UT, and so the Secret Service went and got them. He's trying to call his wife, and First Lady Laura Bush was in Ted Kennedy's office, Senator Kennedy, and had been rushed down to underneath the Senate, and then she had to be found, and there were communications issues on Air Force One, and he's getting very frustrated. And then in the middle of it, he stops and he calls his parents. And he says to his parents, where are you? And they said, oh, we're in Bloomfield, Wisconsin. And he said, what are you doing there? President Bush 41 said, because you grounded our plane, and then in the middle of the day, he's in and around these conversations with national security and with defense. And then he stops and he calls Ted Olson. Ted Olson was the Solicitor General in the Bush versus Gore election Supreme Court recount dispute. Ted Olson's wife happened to be on the airplane that crashed into the Pentagon. And then at the end of the day, the whole end of the day, back to Omaha, then he's back to D.C., and he says, we're going back to D.C. People didn't want him to go back. It wasn't safe. He said, the American president is going to sleep in his own bed tonight. That is important. So he was trying to talk to his family. He finally got in touch with his daughter, Barbara, literally about 15 or 20 minutes before he was on national TV at 8 o'clock that night. And so when I look at that day as a whole, what's so stunning is you look at all that and think there was no script. This was probably the last thing on his mind that was going to happen when he woke up that morning. But yet during the day, he was a president, he was a commander in chief, he was a leader, he was a father, he was a son, he was a husband, and he was a friend. When I look at that, my respect, I always have a lot of respect for him. I want everybody to study that, because that, to me, that 18-hour period, we all have unscripted moments. Right now in the COVID crisis, I bet if we all sat down a year ago and said, think about your doomsday scenarios, think about, where we might be a year from now, and think about what could happen to our business. Okay. Yeah. People were predicting maybe we're in late stage of an expansion. There's going to be a recession, maybe Everybody's going to have different scenarios. I doubt somebody would have said, well, maybe it'll be a global pandemic and we'll all be shut down. And we'll go from full employment in February to depression level unemployment by May. I promise you, nobody would have said that, right? So that's 9/11. That's the day of September 11th, 2001. And what President Bush, the way he carried himself, the way he led the country, the words that came out of his mouth, the actions that he did, in my mind, define a person, defined him. And that principled leadership, is what comes out in unscripted moments. And this was completely unscripted. And we all have that in our life. The biggest takeaway for me right now is to think about that. All this is, guys, is an unscripted moment. We all know how to deal with, oh, my business is up 4% this year. Oh, my business is down 3% this year. Oh, this is what's happening. We all know how to deal with that. That's easy. It's not fun. It may be fun, may not be fun. But right now, we're in an unscripted moment. Those are the special needs that we all have at moments like this to get through. And that's where President Bush's experience, I think, is really so valuable. And that's the big lesson for me. I know that was long-winded, Craig, but...
No, it was, listen, there is no interrupting that story. I've heard it 4 times, and I assume in my study here, the temperature must have gone down because I got chills. I mean, it's such a great story. And for those who visit this beautiful presidential library, it's an iPad you will totally miss if you don't look at it. And it's got minute by minute detail of President Bush's day, some of which is still classified to this day. And Ken, I think it's very special for people to hear you tell that story beginning to end. I'm struck with the equanimity. I mean, you hear equanimity come through over and over, these unscripted moments. Either we can freak out and overreact to everything, or we can think with some clarity of thought. It's so powerful.
Or cut yourself a break if it's not clear, right? Especially for people who are highly educated, and everybody who's listening to this podcast has gone to law school and fancy degrees and young masters of the universe and all that stuff. But it's okay not to know. Take a breath, take a pause, break it down, and just understand at a question's core what is being asked. And sometimes we get freaked out because we want to control everything. We want to put everything we can in a box of understanding. And maybe some things are not comprehensible. We do not know today what the post-COVID crisis is going to look like. Okay. Now, I, for one, think that in chaos, there's opportunity. And for every business that is being disrupted, there are other businesses that are being created. And if I told you 5 years ago that you could make a living in the gig economy, you probably would have slapped me. And then it became commonplace that people were working in the gig and sharing economy. But 5 and 10 years ago, somebody said, oh, we're going to have a sharing economy. You're going to be like, what are you talking about? And be like, COVID, what are you talking about? I mean, so there'll be things that emerge from this, and we don't know what will emerge. So what's exciting to me is being a participant in sort of uncovering these opportunities that will emerge. Because the one thing that won't go away is human ingenuity. And if 15 or 20 million people are unemployed, 15 or 20 million people are not going to sit around and say, well, I guess I'm just going to sit here. Vast majority of those are going to say, damn it, I got to get up and go and figure out what I'm going to do. And a subset of those are going to say, hey, what if? And they may create the next Uber of whatever, right? And it may not be Uber, but all that Uber talent is going to go somewhere, and so that to me is what's exciting. And you just got to have confidence that it'll happen, because every time somebody has said, that's it, ATM machines are going to, there'll be no more banks. There'll be no more bank tellers. Bank unemployment will be everywhere. Banks employ more people today in an ATM era than they ever did. Oh, online banking, there goes, it's just, these estimates are just crazy. Oh, everybody's going to have a computer. There'll be no more printing. The paper business will go out of business. I have more paper than I've ever had in my life. So in a paperless society, I've just never been a believer when people say, oh, this is going to be the end of the world as we know it. That may be true, but open that door and see what you find, because the one constant is human ingenuity. And it is amazing what people do and come up with. I don't know. I really don't know. I can make some goofy predictions and some intuition, but it'll be really interesting to see.
Well, I'm going to make you make a goofy prediction or two in a minute, and it won't be goofy, but it's the poetic REM song, right? It's the end of the world as we know it, and I'll be fine. It's true, and it's great, and it's interesting to sit in this time and actually have some clarity of thought, because we're all in our own homes, try to create that space to do it. So you're a minority owner of the Texas Rangers, the best baseball club in the world, at least by yours and my views. You own esports franchises. We're sitting here, who would have thought, add to the list of your crazy, unpredictable moments that a documentary about a basketball season from 20 years ago or 21 years ago would be the #1 rated television, like people watching it as the documentary is coming out, about Michael Jordan, for those who are seeing this later. But talk about esports, talk about your vision for the concept behind taking gaming into a revenue producing, not just for the manufacturer of the gaming, but people watching the games play.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not a gamer, and gaming is one of these things that 10 or 15 years ago, people would have said, huh, what are you talking about? And now there are professional video game sports leagues, and these are highly evolved skills like golf, and where it's a real skills game, and it's reflexes and it's strategy and it's concentration. And I could think of it like NASCAR, where you sit there and go, these people are just driving a car around the track. They just sit down and turn left for 3 hours. How can that be hard? But you're going 200 miles an hour and you're 6 inches away from the people next to you, and the amount of intensity and the concentration and the reflex. I mean, it's an athletic endeavor, no question. And so gaming has evolved at the highest level, and people respect that. And so people watch it the way, you and I as amateur golfers, Craig, may watch a golf tournament. People watching us who aren't golfers go, why are you watching this tournament? It's so stupid. It's a bunch of people walking around hitting a little white ball, But for people who play the game, say, did you see the way that oh my God, that putt swung 12 inches and it right at the end and it went, oh my God, what a read. Somebody looking at us go, how could that be exciting? That because we understand it. And so in gaming, there's absolutely no difference. And so there's a cultural movement with gaming globally that exceeds virtually all other sports. There are 300 to 400 million gamers on this planet. And a gamer isn't somebody who goes to the arcade once a year. These are people who play a competitive video game at least once a month. And there's a whole other subset of those types that are enthusiasts, where they're actually watching other professionals or watching other players play games. And that's measured in the hundreds of millions as well. Globally, it's global. Domestically, it's also huge, and it's growing. These numbers are growing, 15% compounded. They're just ridiculous numbers. So in the last few years, the esports the publishers of the game have organized leagues around the games that they publish. These leagues now have a viewership that is second only to the NFL. It passed the NBA this year. If you're not watching esports, you're not in the target market. But if you are in that target market, this is not unusual. So, I will tell you that it's growing. It's everywhere. It's global. Okay. The closest analog I have is Premier Soccer, that, Arsenal has fans all over the world, and people don't even know where Arsenal is. Or Man U has fans all over the world, and people couldn't maybe not know what's the man stand for and where is it? And so there are, our Team Envy. We have a following all over the world. We have an Overwatch team called the Dallas Fuel. We have a Call of Duty team called the Dallas Empire. These are paid professionals. They compete against other cities' teams. Right now, today, as we speak, the Dallas Empire is the #1 rated Call of Duty team in the world. And we're using, you mentioned the Michael Jordan kind of filling the void on TV. This month, every Saturday, we have the Lone Star Challenge, which is the Dallas Fuel against the Houston Outlaws, which is an Overwatch. 2 Overwatch teams are going to be on network television, on weekend network television during the day. So, for me, the attraction was watching this virtual world transfer into the physical world. And we've held esports tournaments, and we sell out. 4,000 people show up in an arena, and they're screaming, and they paint their faces, and they got the thunder sticks, and it's Bud Light, and it's Favor, and it's Jack in the Box. And, these are real sponsors, just like you would be sitting at the ballpark. And it's a real community. And the challenge with this community is, unlike going to a baseball game, this community lives online. And if you were going to play a video game against me or with me, you have to go to your house and get on your high-speed computer with your headphones. I go to my house and I put on my headphones, and you and I are connected online, but we are in 2 physical spaces. Nobody has a trading floor, like a Goldman Sachs trading floor of computers lined up, right? That's emerging. But so you had this community that was all together, but they were all they had to be in their own homes, wherever they play their games. So now with esports tournaments and conventions and gatherings, people can find their friends. And it's amazing, because once they're all together, they're like, oh, I play that game, you do too. How do you, and where are you from? I mean, the amount of connection, because they were all connected before, they were just connected online. Anyway, and so watching the convergence of this virtual world and this physical world is really fascinating. And that, to me, from a business perspective, is a huge opportunity. And that's what attracted me to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So do take out your crystal ball, because this will be a little bit of a time capsule, and tell us something that We're all kind of waiting for the sport. The NFL just announced their schedule, but no one said, oh, we're going to have fans in the stand, and certainly not 100,000 fans in the stands. Tell us how is this going to play out pre-vaccine for professional sports?
I don't have a crystal ball on that.
Yeah.
The reporters, the reporters have nothing else to report on except how we're going to get back to playing. So the reports are actually, I think, pretty real time, and I'm reading them, as you're reading them. I'm encouraged. I think we're going to get back. The question is on timing, and the question is how it's staged. We're getting more and more knowledge every day about the disease and who's susceptible and who's not, and how to guard yourself, and how, what are the risk areas. And, we got to get through this tragedy phase first. And I am encouraged that I hope we are, that we're moving in the right direction. And, we've all gotten a lesson now on the importance of hygiene and hand washing. We all understand now the word social and distancing. We didn't know what those words meant 3 months ago. I think that we're going to have a jaundiced view of handshaking and hugging, for a while. But I'm also very, very encouraged that I believe there will be treatments and there will be a vaccine and there'll be testing. And we're just in that phase where the scale of this issue is just unfathomable. When we have disaster recovery plans, we assume there might be a hurricane. And so if the hurricane, we assume that it'll be in one place. And after a few days, we can move in this country, we can move resources from healthy places to those places. Where we get in trouble is when 2 hurricanes hit at the same time, or 3, but think about this as a global hurricane. Everybody needed everything, and there was no movement of anything. And, as a society and as a planet, we kind of play statistics when it comes to how much liquidity do you need as a bank? Well, you don't assume there's a run on the bank. You know enough because you're playing statistics on how many people are going to come, and then you add a buffer and a reserve just so you have enough cash on hand. Well, imagine if there was a run on a bank, on every bank, on the same day, and then people criticize, well, there wasn't enough liquidity in the system. I mean, you don't model that. If we want to model it back to 1918, well, then I guess we can. We need to cut everybody some slack. We got to understand that this isn't a new event. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of ingenuity. There's a lot of smarts. There's a lot of sharing. But what I do know also at the same time is every major medical resource on this planet is now geared to this coronavirus molecule. Drop what you're doing. We're coming here. Okay. Every AI application that can, every resource that we know is geared towards treatment and prevention. That to me is encouraging.
Ken, you've given us so many interesting observations about the pandemic. What's one thing that has changed during the pandemic that won't go away?
That's a good question. I think that we've accelerated the comfort that we have with this technology. And if you think about the perfectionism of the broadcast industry and the presentation industry that sort of got thrown out the window because newscasts had to be done from people's living rooms and studies and podcasts like this, and the world understands and gets it. And I make the analogy to when business casual took over. And yes, there are still places and times that are appropriate for business attire, but for the most part, our economy, the U.S. business community is now business casual. And so I think that this forum, people will be more apt to try it and to apologize for technical difficulties and just move on, right? And the business letter got replaced by email. Doesn't mean there aren't still business letters, but so much activity now is more real time with email. So I think this is just another progression. Back to my first point, though, and I do want to stress, please don't let it consume you. Because one of the reasons, Craig, you and I can have this conversation is because we have the personal relationship. If you start a relationship on Zoom, can't take the place of a dinner together, a lunch together, or even an in-person meeting together. It can't take the place. And we're going to have to redouble our efforts to remind ourselves that, yes, I can do a Zoom call, or yes, I can do a WebEx, but you know what? Let's get together. Because it's just not the same. And so that's going to be a challenge because there's going to be heck of a lot of people, just like email. And there's a generation of business people that only know email that are coming up. And back to my conversation earlier, they have email relationships with people. They have a telephonic relationship with people. They may never see them face to face. It works fine for a while, but it can never take the place. And that's where the magic happens, is when you have that personal relationship.
That's a great way to end it. I mean, it's that feedback loop concept. We've got to constantly be curious and seek out all that information that will instruct our instincts, whether it's through a pandemic or anything in life.
And in the law profession, you're selling your knowledge, but you're also selling trust. And so I can treat my attorneys as encyclopedic resources. Hey, I'm calling you, what does the law say about this, that, and the other thing? And you give me an answer. That's good. But do I have that relationship to where I trust you to go, while I have you, let me ask you about something else. Is this right? I know it's legal, but how do you think it would play out? Or what do you think? And that trust comes from something different than just the recitation of the law, right? And so I think that it's really important in the service businesses to not forget that trust element is also a big part of what you have to offer. And that trust goes both ways. So that's something that we need to be careful of, that I would caution people about on the backside of the shutdown.
Yeah, no, thank you. You're fabulous. You know how much I admire you. You do so much good for the world. It's reflected by the fact that when I meet strangers, they talk about the influence you've had on their lives. Maybe you don't even know it, but they say it. So, and they're strangers to me, obviously not to you. So thank you.
You've done the same, my friend. You've done the same, my friend. So you should feel great about that as well.
Thank you.
We're all doing our little parts.
All we can do. Great to see you. Give hugs to the family, and hopefully we can do this again one time. Do it in person.
Okay. We'll do it in person. Okay.
That's right.
All right.
Bye.
Be safe.